Denise and Ed Bozarth had a life most people would envy.
Living on a boat, hanging out, wearing flip-flops.
They really didn't work.
And they didn't have to.
He used to walk around with like a Ziploc baggie full of nothing but hundreds.
But then a mysterious death
It was obvious that the body had been there for some time.
would leave the authorities wondering.
His past might have come back to haunt him.
There were a lot of rumors that he flew drugs back and forth from South America.
That he was an informant for the Drug Enforcement Agency.
Or was it possible Denise had some secrets of her own?
Ed did ask me if Denise was cheating on him.
Key Largo, Florida, July 1st, 2007. It was a lazy Sunday evening on the largest of the Florida Keys.
Key Largo is great snorkeling, great fishing, blue water. It's paradise. It's absolutely beautiful.
And the lifestyle is relaxed and very laid back.
It's a very small town, really kind of sleepy place.
And few places in Key Largo were sleepier than Gilbert's Marina.
Gilbert's is a quintessential Keys kind of a place. It's a marina. There's a bar there. There's kind of a rundown hotel there.
The people Gilbert's drew were a mix of tourists, weekenders, and what the locals call liveaboards.
There are a significant number of individuals on the Keys that live on their boats.
A group of people that congregate mostly around the tiki bars.
There's a heavy drinking culture in Key Largo.
Although on that particular Sunday night, at least one resident of Gilbert's was hard at work instead.
A volunteer firefighter with the Key Largo Fire Department owned a vessel that was dry docked at the marina he was working on and fixing up.
But while he worked, he couldn't help notice the smell coming from the 36-foot cabin cruiser in the next berth.
Something that was very, very strong and very, very pungent.
The firefighter hailed the boat.
The boat was called the Screw You Too.
And when no one answered, the firefighter clambered aboard to investigate.
He went over to the boat, lifted the hatch.
And when he did, the sickly sweet odor was overpowering.
The Keys are very hot in the summertime. They maintain a consistent temperature around the 90s.
One whiff was all it took. The firefighter slammed the hatch shut, pulled out his cell phone, and dialed 911 to report a dead body.
As a firefighter, he knew what death smelled like.
The body was still aboard the boat, and it was obvious that the body had been there for some time.
Although before sheriff's deputies even arrived on the scene, the caller had a pretty good idea just who the dead body might be. Because the boat belonged to an eccentric liveaboard named Ed Bozarth and his wife, Denise. Born in 1973, Denise grew up in the Florida Panhandle on the opposite end of the state from the Keys.
Denise's parents lived in Defeat Springs, Florida. It's a mostly rural area just to the west of Tallahassee.
Her father was a Florida state trooper, and he raised his daughter to be respectful, hardworking, and quiet.
She was very reserved when it came to talking about herself.
Not that there was much to tell. Denise married young, but the marriage ended in divorce, and by her mid-20s, she was living on her own in South Florida, eking out a living with a series of low-paying part-time jobs.
She was a waitress. She was out at the shrimp docks, just doing what she could to get by.
And she wasn't afraid of hard work or manual labor.
She was a fairly stocky and strong woman.
And it was while working on the docks in the mid-90s, helping unload the day's catch, that she met Ed Bozarth. Born in 1945, Ed grew up in Miami and spent most of his adult life as a pilot, flying all over South Florida, the Caribbean, and Latin America.
My dad loved to fly. He was a spray plane pilot for a while. He flew DC-3s, which he really enjoyed.
Although when he met Denise, he'd recently given up crop dusting and flying charters to try his hand at being a shrimp boat captain.
He liked the solitude about boating. He liked the freedom to be able to go wherever you wanted to go.
And while he'd been married and divorced multiple times,
He had fathered children by, I think, 3 women.
he was most comfortable being alone.
My dad was a very complicated person. He was someone that would sit back and observe people.
However, the admitted loner was also in his mid-50s, and shrimping was hard physical labor. So after a few weeks observing the hard-working young woman hustling to unload the daily catch on the docks, he offered to hire Denise on as crew.
She would run the shrimp boat with my dad. That's pretty much where everything started. You know, she started working for him.
And it wasn't long before Ed and Denise were more than just captain and first mate, too.
They just became close.
Despite the fact that they made an unlikely-looking couple.
Ed's real thin. He's not a real big guy.
He was like pretty much bony almost. Denise was a big, hefty woman.
And there was a big difference in their ages, too.
Mr. Bozarth was 25 years older than Denise.
However, Ed quickly fell for his much younger first mate.
He loved her. That was clear to see.
Denise must have felt the same way about Ed, too. Because when he asked Denise to marry him, she said yes.
They got married June of '98.
And for all their differences, the marriage appeared to work.
Their relationship seemed absolutely, completely normal. I mean, Ed was a little bit possessive. She would get upset with him sometimes about certain things, but they seemed to get along fine.
In fact, they soon started a family.
He had 2 children with Denise.
Ed was pushing 60, though. And by 2001, he and Denise had sold the shrimp boat and bought a cabin cruiser.
Yeah, it's a 36-foot Trojan twin inboard. It was fairly tight quarters. It was laid out fairly nicely.
We had sleeping in the bottom level, 2 rooms. One was the kids and one was Ed and Denise's room. And then, of course, you had the living room, which had the kitchen and, a little common area.
Denise and Ed sailed the cabin cruiser to Key Largo, leased a berth at Gilbert's, and settled in to semi-retirement.
He did some various jobs around the marina and assisted people with various work projects or mechanical issues.
And while Ed tinkered, Denise focused on raising the couple's 2 toddlers.
They really didn't work.
They didn't really need to either. Shrimping, or something, had apparently been very good to Ed Bozarth.
He used to walk around with like a Ziploc baggie full of nothing but hundreds.
And he'd unzip that bag whenever Denise needed something.
Ed gave her everything that she ever wanted. He would do anything for this woman.
Not that she ever wanted much. Living on a boat with 2 small children may have been a little crowded, but it did allow Ed and Denise to enjoy the sort of laid-back Florida Keys lifestyle other people could only experience on vacation.
They had access to the bar and the restaurant and could go out in the ocean with the boat.
They were living the dream life of the Keys, living on a boat, hanging out, wearing flip-flops.
Denise also spent a fair amount of her evenings hanging around Gilbert's Tiki Bar.
She was kind of a bar fly.
They had bands on the weekends, which were actually lovely to go sit and listen to. It was just a really beautiful place to go hang out. Very friendly.
Ed, on the other hand, kept mostly to himself.
We'd say we're going to the tiki bar. Ed would hand her money so she could go out and have a great time with just be careful. That's all he ever said to her. He'd kiss her and say, just be careful.
And then he'd go back to tinkering around the couple's cabin cruiser.
People barely ever saw Ed off the boat.
He didn't have very many friends.
And the few he had often had a hard time getting in touch with him.
He didn't have email. He didn't have a cell phone.
While the outgoing Denise drank at the bar, Ed had increasingly become a hermit, one whose philosophy was best summed up by what he'd christened their cabin cruiser, the Screw You Too.
It's just his attitude and his approach toward, people.
He liked his privacy. He didn't want people to know his business.
Or was there more to it than that? Thanks to that bag of cash he always carried around, the gossip at Gilbert's Tiki Bar was that in addition to being eccentric, the former pilot was also in hiding.
There were a lot of rumors that he flew drugs back and forth from South America.
Not only would that explain all the cash, Ed dropped a fair number of hints himself, spinning all sorts of wild tales on those rare nights he did turn up in the Tiki Bar.
He always talked about missions that he was on, the airplanes that he was in, shooting, jumping out of an airplane, just all sorts of craziness.
Although the way Ed told it, he wasn't a drug smuggler. In his version of the story, Ed was always working for the good guys.
The legend of Ed Bozarth was that he was some sort of informant or an agent for either the DEA or the CIA.
Whether Denise's husband had really been a drug dealer or a DEA informant, it was tough to know for sure.
Who knows in the Keys? A lot of people have stories.
It just seemed too fascinating to be true.
And as it turned out, Ed Bozarth had one more good story in him, even if he wouldn't live to tell it. At 11:30 on the night of July 1st, 2007, a volunteer firefighter who lived in a Key Largo, Florida marina noticed a suspicious odor coming from the boat in the next berth.
And he described the smell as being very horrific.
It was very noticeable because the smell was prevalent throughout the parking lot.
Law enforcement was called and boarded the vessel.
And when the deputies went below decks, they found the source of the odor, a man's dead body.
He was found in the starboard engine compartment.
The body itself was wrapped inside a sail bag, the type of bag you'd store a sail aboard a sailboat.
He was very badly decomposed.
Despite that, it was obvious how the man had died.
His head had been bashed in.
It was obvious it was a homicide.
And whoever had killed him had meant to keep it a secret as long as possible.
The interior of the vessel was air conditioned. There were two different air conditioning units that were set to the lowest temperature on the thermostats.
It also appeared that the killer had tried to clean up the crime scene, too.
The carpet had been removed.
But when the killer pulled up the carpet, they must have realized that short of sinking the boat, there was little hope in totally destroying the evidence.
There was what appeared to be blood on the floorboards.
Had that discovery caused the killer to give up and leave the body behind? For the moment, the investigators had no idea, but they did have a clue as to who the body in the boat might be.
The registered owner was Edward Bozarth, and the information that we obtained early that morning was that he, his wife Denise, and their two small children lived aboard that vessel.
Everyone in the marina knew whose boat it was.
Confirming that the body was Ed's would take time, though. So while coroner's personnel removed it for the autopsy, the investigators fanned out across the marina to question Ed and Denise's neighbors. One of the first people they spoke to was a marina security guard named Campbell, who lived on a boat moored near Ed and Denise's cabin cruiser.
Docked probably about 50 feet or so behind the Bozarth's vessel. And after knocking on the door a few times, he finally opened the hatch.
Like all the other liveaboards at Gilbert's Marina, the guard knew Ed and Denise, but he told the investigators he didn't know anything about what had happened. In fact, he didn't seem all that curious about it either.
He didn't question the fact that there were law enforcement vehicles and crime scene tape all over the place, which was kind of odd.
Other neighbors were far more intrigued, though, and several in the group that gathered just outside the crime scene tape told the investigators they hadn't seen Ed Bozarth around for about a week. But they also said that wasn't unusual, given the retiree's antisocial tendencies.
They wondered where he was, but they had not been terribly concerned.
Neighbors also said that Denise and the couple's 2 children had been gone even longer.
The children had gone to stay with their grandparents in North Florida 2 weeks prior to this. 1 week after that, Denise had left town to go up to her parents in North Florida as well.
And according to at least some of their neighbors, Denise hadn't planned on coming back. At least that was the gossip around Gilbert's Tiki Bar.
Most people said that Denise and Ed did not have a good marriage.
However, that wasn't the only or even the juiciest thing that the investigators learned from Ed and Denise's neighbors.
There had been a rumor that he was an informant for the Drug Enforcement Agency back in the 80s.
And now that Ed had been murdered, his neighbors couldn't help but wonder. Maybe it was true.
There was some speculation that his past might have come back to haunt him.
Someone coming for revenge.
Was it possible that Ed's murder was drug-related? When the investigators followed up with the DEA, they hit a dead end.
They either couldn't or wouldn't provide any information.
Not even to law enforcement, local law enforcement.
With the DEA unable to either confirm or deny the rumors, the possibility of a drug hit was starting to sound a little more plausible. But when the investigators contacted Ed's older daughter, Ariana, with the news that her dad was dead, she offered up an entirely different theory, one concerning her stepmother.
The lead investigator, I told him instantly, Denise did it.
Not that Ed's daughter actually had any proof.
It was just one of those things where you have that gut instinct.
The investigators needed more than a gut instinct, though. And by that evening, they had made the long drive to North Florida to interview Denise at her parents' house in Defuniak Springs.
She was surprisingly calm and cooperative. She didn't have that concern or that shock that someone would have, even if they were in a bad relationship, that their spouse was just found murdered.
Perhaps. Although according to Denise, Bad didn't even begin to describe her relationship with Ed.
Denise said that he was physically abusive to her.
Denise said her son, not yet 10, could back her up on that, too.
One of the 2 children living with them on the boat told police that he had seen Ed give his mother a black eye.
Denise told the investigators that Ed had been beating her for years.
It was an ongoing, abusive relationship.
But according to Denise, that was the first time he had actually struck her in front of the kids. And she said that had finally spurred her to take action.
On June 16th, her parents picked up her 2 children.
And a week later, Denise had followed.
She moved out. She packed her bags and left for Defuniak Springs.
But had she done more than just leave Ed? The investigators fished for a confession.
I gave her an out. I gave her the battered wife syndrome. I said, look, you did it. It was probably during self-defense. Just tell us exactly what happened.
But Denise didn't take the bait.
She came across as just not really knowing much.
And unlike her neighbors at the marina, she wasn't willing to speculate either.
Denise did not have anything to say as far as what might have happened.
Could Ed tell them something about his killer, though? On July 3rd, the Monroe County Medical Examiner performed an autopsy on the body tentatively identified as Ed Bozarth.
The medical examiner was able to determine that the cause of death was blunt force trauma.
The weapon would be consistent with something like a hammer.
The medical examiner positively identified the body as Ed's a few days later.
He had to be sent up for forensic analysis by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement because his body was so badly decayed.
They were no closer to identifying his killer, however.
We were being very objective, not being just focused on one person.
Although that didn't stop them from going back to the marina and re-interviewing Denise and Ed's neighbors to try and confirm what she'd told them about her husband's abuse.
We saw that there was motive.
And the marina staff, Ed and Denise's fellow liveaboards, and even the regulars at Gilbert's Tiki Bar all appeared to confirm it.
The majority of the witnesses that we spoke to described Ed as being very controlling.
One woman called him creepy.
And she had a point, considering all the things friends and neighbors said that Ed did.
And not allowing Denise to go to the bathroom for more than 10 minutes. He wouldn't allow her to use her cell phone unless he was present.
Some even confirmed her son's story, more or less.
Denise had told her friends and other people at the marina that Ed had been physically abusive to her.
He was rumored to have given her a black eye shortly before Denise left town.
However, the investigators also noticed something odd about all the rumors of abuse floating around the marina.
We don't have documentation of domestic violence between them prior to this murder.
There are no eyewitnesses that ever saw any kind of physical altercation between the two of them.
And even if there had been, few people at the marina would have pegged Ed as the winner.
Describing Denise as being the controlling part of that relationship.
Denise was significantly bigger than Ed. Ed was a small man. Denise is a big woman.
But the biggest surprise came when the investigators spoke to the marina security guard for a second time.
We had a lengthy interview with him.
And this time, Campbell admitted to being less than forthcoming with the detectives the first time they spoke.
He ultimately ended up telling the police that he had lied.
For starters, Campbell told the investigators that he had a very good reason to be concerned about Ed's murder.
He had had an affair with Denise.
By the 4th of July, 2007, it had been a little more than 48 hours since Denise Bozarth's husband, Ed, had been found dead on the couple's boat in a Key Largo marina.
He was decaying. That's why he was discovered, is because of the smell.
Some neighbors speculated that the 62-year-old retired pilot had been killed because of his supposed past as a DEA informer.
One of the rumors that kept coming back to us said that Ed was probably killed by somebody that he had, shared information on.
But that wasn't the only theory floating around the marina.
The other theory was that his wife killed him.
They were known to be fighting, and he was rumored to have beaten her shortly before Ed ended up being found dead.
And one of the Bozarth's neighbors, the marina security guard whose boat was berthed in the next slip, had just admitted to having an affair with Denise.
He admitted that he had had a sexual relationship with Denise Bozarth and had for at least a month before Mr. Bozarth's death.
But was the affair the motive for murder, or merely part of the setup? Because the fact that he'd been sleeping with Denise wasn't the only bombshell Campbell dropped during his interview.
Denise had offered him $10,000 to kill her husband.
The security guard said he'd refused Denise's offer, but the investigators couldn't help but wonder, had she gone ahead without him?
We questioned, was it possible for Denise alone to not only kill Ed, but to tie him up and stuff him into a bag in the boat? And yes, she could have done that with him. He's not a real big guy.
Why Denise might want Ed murdered was fairly clear to investigators.
They were fighting. There was apparently physical abuse.
But when the investigators spoke to Ed's adult children from his previous marriages, they discovered that Denise may have had another motive: money.
Ed's family expressed concerns that Denise would inherit several $100,000 if Ed were to die.
Ed Bozarth recently came into $600,000.
And despite Ed's habit of carrying around a plastic bag full of cash, it wasn't drug money or a payoff from the DEA.
It was an insurance policy from his dead mother.
The source of Ed's cash may have been anticlimactic, but it made for a powerful motive, especially when combined with rumors of an abusive marriage.
She was involved in a very bad relationship, and there was an incentive to get out of it and to be rewarded for getting out of it.
And then there was the fact that Denise had left Key Largo at the same time her husband disappeared.
As she packed up and left June 23rd, and Ed was found on July 1st.
The last time that he had been seen was the day that she left.
Motive, timing, and the fact that she tried to pay another man to do the job. For the authorities, it all added up to one thing. Denise Bozarth had murdered her husband.
There really wasn't any other individual that was realistically responsible for this crime.
But while the authorities were convinced, could they convince a jury? For starters, Denise had no record.
How can you go from not being a violent person to committing a murder in such a violent, brutal fashion as she did, bashing her husband's head in?
They couldn't use forensics to put the murder weapon, believed to be a hammer, in Denise's hand either. In fact, the investigators never found it.
We did search the water underneath the boat, and it was not found.
What forensic evidence they did have was of little use.
Her DNA would have been on the boat because she lived there. So that wouldn't tell us really anything.
And considering the source, the one piece of evidence connecting Denise to the murder, the security guards claimed that she'd offered him $10,000 to do it, was just as problematic.
He was definitely a suspicious character, particularly considering that he was close to Denise.
Not only did he admit to having an affair with Denise, he'd already lied to them once, initially claiming to know nothing about the murder. And that left the investigators uncertain whether to believe Campbell when he said he'd refused Denise's offer of $10,000 to kill Ed.
We actually have never been able to rule him out.
All in all, it added up to a very shaky case, and the prosecutors would only get one shot at a conviction.
In a homicide, you don't get a second chance, and if they're exonerated, that's it. They're done.
So for the moment, they waited.
They just did not have the evidence they needed to go arrest Denise.
And in 2010, after 3 years passed with no new evidence,
They declared the case inactive.
by 2011, the murder of Ed Bozarth was just another of the many stories told over margaritas at Gilbert's Tiki Bar.
It's a very small town, so when a homicide happens, there's a lot of talk.
Stories were about all that was left, too. After the murder, Denise had sold Ed's boat, moved back to northern Florida, and started her life over again.
She was living with a boyfriend.
But just when it appeared that Ed's murder was destined to be nothing more than another piece of local folklore, there was a new sheriff in town, literally. And after winning the election, he decided to review a few of the unsolved cases his predecessor left behind.
The Bozarth case being one of them. So he assigned a new detective to basically start the investigation over again from the beginning.
They put new eyes on it.
One of the first things the new investigator assigned to the case did was make the long drive to the Florida Panhandle to question Denise again.
he went and re-interviewed her several times.
And when he asked her when was the last time she saw Ed, Denise gave a different answer. Previously, when talking to the detectives, Denise claimed she'd last seen Ed asleep in their cabin on the boat. But this time,
She says that he had got on a bus and was going to go to Key Largo, and that's the last time she saw him.
of course, it had been 4 years since the murder. Maybe she'd forgotten. But the investigators did talk to someone who had a much better memory of the events leading up to Ed's death. A friend of Denise and Ed's named Bonnie Colon. Bonnie had been living in Inverness, Florida, when she met Denise and Ed in 2005.
I was working at a restaurant and they came in all the time. Ed's mom passed away and they were staying at Ed's mom's house until all the stuff was sold.
Bonnie had quickly taken a liking to the couple, especially the eccentric Ed and his wild stories.
Ed would tell me about missions he was on in South America, and he would always just have something amazing to say.
The waitress remained friends with the couple after they returned to Key Largo, too. In fact, she'd gone down to visit them several times, including one lengthy visit in June of 2007, just before Ed's murder.
She had been present on the boat for several weeks prior to Ed Bozarth's death.
My divorce was going through and they invited me to stay with them.
And when the police tracked her down and spoke with her at the end of 2011, Bonnie told the investigators that she hadn't been living with the Bozarths long before she realized their marriage was in trouble, too.
Ed did ask me if Denise was cheating on him.
And according to Bonnie, the answer wasn't just yes. She made the affair sound far more serious than the security guard had ever let on.
They were talking about taking off and going somewhere in the Caribbean.
However, Bonnie said that running off with her boyfriend wasn't all that Denise had talked about that June.
So she started talking about killing Ed.
She was frustrated with him. She wanted a way out.
At the time, Bonnie said that's all she thought Denise was doing, venting her frustration.
A lot of people say that they want to kill their boyfriends or their girlfriends. So I just always thought that she was just, messing around or just saying stuff.
Although according to Bonnie, the stuff Denise said had included possible ways of killing her husband.
She was talking about how she could just knock him over his head and throw him into the water. I always thought it was just a joke.
But the investigators weren't laughing, especially when they heard another one of the scenarios Denise had supposedly come up with.
She had told Bonnie that one of the ways that she wanted to kill her husband was to hit him in the head with a hammer while he was sleeping, cover him in plastic, and put him in an engine compartment. Turns out, though, just happened to be the way that my dad was actually murdered.
Joking or not, Bonnie said that Denise talked about killing Ed so often that she had eventually found somewhere else to stay.
She got tired of Denise talking about wanting to kill Ed, so she left.
That wasn't the end of Bonnie's story, though. She told the investigators that she'd gotten a cryptic call on June 23rd, 2007, a week before Ed's body had been found, warning her to stay away from their boat.
Denise called me to tell me not to go to the boat. She was leaving Ed. She didn't want me to get involved.
Or in hindsight, was there another reason for the warning?
She didn't want me to find Ed's body.
In March of 2012, it had been almost 5 years since a neighbor found Ed Bozarth dead on the boat he shared with his wife Denise in Key Largo, Florida.
He had smelled his decomposing body. He hadn't seen Ed for a little while, so he called the Monroe County Sheriff's Office.
The authorities had long suspected that Denise had killed her husband. The question was whether or not they could prove it.
We had some circumstantial evidence, but we did not have the physical evidence that was needed.
What they did have was a statement from another of Denise's neighbors, a man who also worked as the marina security guard, claiming that she tried to hire him to kill her husband.
She offered $10,000 to Mr. Campbell.
That's what Campbell said, but the authorities weren't sure a jury would believe him. After all, the fact that he was having an affair with Denise gave Campbell a motive to kill Ed, too.
Certainly we had suspicions about Mr. Campbell.
But then, at the end of 2011, a friend of Denise's named Bonnie Cologne had come forward with information that appeared to confirm the guard's story. According to Bonnie, Denise had spent the weeks before the murder talking openly about killing Ed.
Denise had been talking about scenarios much like what ended up happening.
Bonnie stated that Denise wanted to bash Ed in the head and just wrap him up and stuff him away somewhere.
I was like, oh my God, this woman said she was going to kill him, and she did.
So on March 14, 2012, investigators from the Monroe County, Florida Sheriff's Department once again made the 600-mile drive to Defuniak Springs to talk to Denise. And this time, they brought an arrest warrant.
There was definitely sufficient evidence where we could charge Denise with the murder.
When she was apprehended, she was taken to the sheriff's office in Escambia County near Pensacola, and she was given her Miranda warnings.
Not that Denise heeded them. More than anything, the 39-year-old appeared to be in a hurry to get the interview over with.
I asked her to join you, and we were going to be here all day.
Well, no, at that point, I'll just leave. I can't talk to you at that point.
But when given the opportunity to stop the interview then and there, Denise passed on it.
Having these rights of mind, do you wish to talk to us now? That is the question. Yes. Okay.
And at first, Denise claimed that she had nothing to hide. She told the investigators that she and Ed weren't getting along, so she had decided to take the kids and leave.
Did you think there were going to be any issues when you were leaving between him and you? It was okay when you were leaving?
She really didn't say anything substantial for quite some time.
But the investigators kept pressing.
She was confronted by the police with, the inconsistencies of her story.
And that's when Denise's story changed again.
She tells the detectives very reluctantly that she was worried that her husband was going to kill her.
His motto was, bullets always shoot the window bars.
The investigators immediately saw an opening.
Was he being abusive? I mean, I don't want to fill in all the blanks here. I need something pretty strong to understand. Can you just give me a couple of details? Was there any weapons? He had a weapon? Right. You threatened me with it?
She stated that she awoke and that her husband was standing over her and pointing a gun to her head.
He was going to kill me and me too. He killed him too.
Denise said she'd done what anyone would have in her situation.
Was there a fight with your gun?
And when Ed kept coming toward her, Denise said she'd grabbed a hammer lying by the bed and hit her husband with it, repeatedly.
You strike him until he stopped moving?
She hit him so hard that it cracked his skull from one end to the other and one end to the other.
Although Denise confessed to killing Ed, she insisted that she hadn't planned to do it, and that what happened had nothing to do with her affair with the marina security guard.
Did he help you in any way? I mean, I know he wasn't there for the hammer, but did he help you clean up the incident?
And Campbell's claim that Denise had offered him money to kill Ed, or all the things she'd supposedly told Bonnie. According to Denise, they'd simply misunderstood her.
Well, basically told him the same thing I told Barb. The only way I get any relief or be able to get away is if he passed away.
That's what Denise claimed, at least. But the authorities had their doubts.
She was having an affair with Campbell, and Mr. Bozarth had just inherited approximately $650,000.
And for that reason, they had some serious doubts about Denise's self-defense claim.
We speculated that she may have hit him while he was asleep.
So once the interview was over, the investigators transported Denise back to Monroe County, where she was charged with first-degree murder.
We felt that if the case were to proceed to trial, that we would prevail.
But in December of 2013, with the trial fast approaching, something happened that would leave that confidence shattered. During a preliminary hearing on December 17th, Denise's attorney argued that her confession should be excluded from the upcoming trial.
During the interview with Monroe County Sheriff's Office detective, she had apparently asked to speak with her lawyer.
It had happened right before she admitted to killing her husband.
I need you guys to have some kind of a true story that you can lay out that makes sense to us. For your defense attorneys, prosecutors, I think they'll be sympathetic towards what.
Then I told you to do your interest.
Contrary to what he told her at the start, the investigator didn't stop the interview.
Yeah, obviously that's something that you're going to have to work out with your attorney.
And a few minutes later, as the interview continued, Denise brought up the matter of an attorney again.
Will I be able to talk to my attorney today?
You can call him whenever you want.
However, the investigators still didn't stop the interview, a fact the prosecutors tried to downplay.
I thought the detectives adequately answered her question. It was more of an offhand comment like, well, do you think I'm going to need a lawyer?
But the judge disagreed. In fact, he ruled everything past the point Denise first asked for a lawyer inadmissible in court.
The confession was thrown out.
On April 8, 2014, Denise Bozarth stood in a Florida courtroom. It had been almost 7 years since her husband's body had been found on their boat in Key Largo, and a little over a year since the 41-year-old had admitted to killing Ed, a confession that had been ruled inadmissible in court.
They actually had to throw out her confession because investigators did not let her speak to her lawyer.
I was upset that they ended up having to toss the confession.
And what was especially upsetting was that without Denise's confession, a conviction might be tough to come by.
It was going to be a harder case because it was all circumstantial now.
So rather than take their chances at trial, the prosecutors had offered Denise the opportunity to plead guilty to a lesser charge.
After discussing the case at length, it was decided that the case would plead out to a second-degree murder and a 14-year prison sentence.
I would have wished for her to be in there longer, but something is better than nothing.
Denise took the deal.
there was enough evidence to where her lawyers realized she had to make some kind of plea deal.
And she stood before the judge that morning and pleaded guilty to Ed's murder.
I almost think that maybe it's her way of coming to peace with the whole situation.
After 7 long years, the search for Ed Bozarth's killer was finally over. Although the outcome wasn't exactly satisfying.
What's 14 years for killing a man? I think she should have been in jail for a lot longer.
And while the second-degree plea deal was due to necessity, most remain convinced that Ed's murder was premeditated.
I don't think it was a crime of passion. I think that it was cold and calculated and thoroughly thought out. She deserves to serve all 14 years. She deserves to stay there as long as possible.
I love this.